Hello, my name is Dr. Cyndi Kernahan. I'm a professor of psychological sciences at UW, University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I'm a social psychologist by training, and my particular area of interest is teaching about race and racism, which I've done for about 20 or so years, primarily to white students. My institution is predominantly white, but not only to white students. And so I wanted to talk a little bit. I thought what might be helpful for me to share is some things I've learned both through research and personal experience, things I've learned and written about with respect to how best to teach about race and racism, and how I think we can teach about it most effectively right now. I think the biggest idea that I want to try to get across is that it's very important to get beyond the individual. So we tend to think in a United States context, particularly people who are white, but not only people who are white, that racism is something that's very individual. So if you look at polls, many polls have been taken that ask people, do you think that discrimination rooted in individual prejudice is a bigger problem, or discrimination that's rooted in laws and policies? And overwhelmingly, across most racial and ethnic groups, what you find is that people think that the individual prejudice is the bigger problem. And I would argue it's the opposite. And I think many people who study race for a living, and many people who experience racism on a regular basis, may argue that it's more about those laws and policies, that's really where you see a lot more damage being done. Certainly individual is important, but the policy level is what really is where we really see a lot of importance. I think more people are waking up to that now. We hear the word systemic racism talked about a lot. So when you teach about that, how can you frame that for students? And that's kind of where my thinking comes in terms of talking about this. So what I try to do is emphasize definitions of racism that get beyond the individual and help students to see those definitions and how they're applied to different levels. So for example, drawing on the work of Ibram Kendi, whose 2016 book Stamped from the Beginning, he defines racism as about ideas. So a racist idea is any idea that presumes the superiority or inferiority of one racial group over another. Fairly simple to understand. And then if you take that idea, that definition, and you think about it in terms of different levels of where it can be applied, it can be really powerful for framing students' understanding. So drawing from the work of James Jones, who's a social psychologist, I talk about those racist ideas as being expressed both through individual behavior and thinking, institutional or systemic layers, and then cultural. So I tend to talk about in terms of individual racism, institutional or systemic racism, and then cultural racism. Again, using that idea expressed through these different layers. And you can give lots of examples as you're helping students to think through this about, obviously at the individual level, it's easy to understand in terms of how people talk to each other, think about each other, the bias they express. But also at the institutional level, we can think a lot about the policies that lead to the wide disparities that we see. So a really obvious example, and one that I teach extensively about, is housing policy and the ways in which, beginning in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation disproportionately made loans to white people, and this continued and really accelerated after World War II, looking at neighborhood levels and deeming, this is redlining, any neighborhoods that had any Black Americans in them as dangerous or hazardous, and they were literally redlined. And so that policy, thinking about that policy as a racist policy and how it's carried forward, and I don't just leave it in the history too. There's plenty of policies now, like where banks will and won't open branches. There's been a lot of good evidence on that in the run-up to the Great Recession, how subprime loans were made. So you can give students evidence to show them how the racist ideas get expressed through policy, which then has an effect on individuals. And there's lots of great writing that you can use. The Case for Reparations, Ta-Nehisi Coates magazine piece from 2014, is a great example where he weaves in the tales of individual people in addition to and how they are ensnared in these larger policies. And it's a great way to help students see that layer and that level of things. Cultural racism, how racist ideas get expressed through what's deemed appropriate or inappropriate, what's good or bad. Always in an American context, whiteness is held up as the standard, and all other groups are measured against that. And so helping students to think through examples of that. Whose language, whose accents are considered good or bad, standard or substandard English is just one example. Whose holidays are most respected and given time off, for example, is another, but there's lots of examples that you can use there. So again, that framing device of racist idea expressed through individual actions, institutional, systemic policy actions, and cultural actions can help students start to put language to just how vast and ubiquitous racism is, and I think helps people to understand better what people are talking about when they talk about systemic racism. So again, I think even for students who aren't white, who may have much or do have much more daily lived experience of racism, it can be very helpful to have this language if that language isn't available before, like if it hasn't been learned. So that I think can be very powerful. In terms of how to, I have two suggestions. So first, one way to help students start to think about racism in these larger ways is to think about the multiple social identities that all of us inhabit. So this would be our race, but it would also be our gender, our social class, our religious affiliation. There's many of these, our body size, for example. All of these things are social identities that we inhabit and that affect the way that the world treats us through individual actions, cultural beliefs and practices, and also laws and policies. And you can take any one of those social identities and be able to do that. You don't necessarily need to go all through them, but it's very useful early in a semester, I think, to have students think through where they fall along various social identities and what their perception is at the beginning of the class in terms of how much privilege or disadvantage they have based on that social identification. You can have students think about that for a few minutes on their own, give them some structured time to think through that and write down some examples, talk to each other about it, and then have a whole class discussion. Age is another good social identity to think about, and how do you move through spaces where you might be more or less advantaged or disadvantaged based on your social identification and age. So those are ways. What the research tells us is that doing that, particularly when people can see spaces where they're both advantaged and disadvantaged, depending on the student, that can help to diffuse the defensiveness that you often get when people realize that they have privilege and advantage based on social identity. It can be helpful to see the spaces in which one does not. And there are drawbacks to that, obviously, but it can help get you in the door with understanding that, and getting past that initial defensiveness can be incredibly useful. And again, there's some good evidence to suggest that that is the case. The second suggestion I would make has to do with administration. And so what I would argue is that it's very important for administrators, department chairs, deans, and even colleagues in people's departments to understand how difficult it is to teach this. So if you're trying to teach about racism with students, this should be respected and given. You should be given resources. So I would argue that administrators should give more faculty development, more attention to the difficulties of teaching this, and also recognizing the ways in which the difficulties of this are not the same across different racial groups. As a white woman, it's much easier for me to teach about this than it would be for a black woman. And that's borne out in the evidence. That's very, very clear. It affects teaching evaluations. People need to understand this so that it is not harmful to people's careers when they do choose to teach about this, and that the emotional toll and the difficulty of this is recognized. Thanks so much.